Tere hommikust, hea haridusrahvas, kui lubate nii kuidagi kokku võtta, aga ka lugupeetud diplomaadid, suursaadikud, maavalitsejad, kohaliku omavalitsuse esindajad. Suur hea meel on teie kõigiga kohtuda Eesti, Koostöö, Kogu ja tema partnerite poolt ellu kutsutud haridusstrateegia 2020 järjekordsel kokkusaamisel konverentsil pealkirjaga Elukestva õppe Eestis, nihutades piire. Ja peab tunnistama alati, et kui nii palju haridusega seotud inimesi istub saalis, siis teatud selline hea äratundev kõhedus tekib mu sisse, mis tõttu ma väga pikalt ei hakka rääkima sellest, mis päeval ees seisab. Julgen nimetada mõned üksikud tehnilised detailid. First of all, I want to say welcome from visitors from abroad. If you need any translation, please find gadgets and channel 2 and you can get translation. Kes soovib siis ingliskeelsete ettekannete jaoks tõlget, siis alustame kõigepealt sellest, olge head. Neid vahendeid vist saab veel kas sealt saali tagant otsast või siis eest. Ärge peljake neid kiiresti enesele hankida, sest 2 ettekannet kohe alguses on erakordselt sisulised ja inglisekeelsed, mis tähendab, et 100% kohalviibimise ja arusaamise heaks võib tõesti kasutada meie 2 professionaalse tõlgi abi. Veel ma oleksin väga liigutud, kui te vaataksite järele oma mobiilsed seadmed, püüaksite nad panna hääletule režiimile, et esinejaid, aga ka siis kohalviibijaid oluliste, aga võib-olla selle saali kontekstis ülejäänud inimeste seisukoha pealt mitte nii tähtsate kõnedega segada. Ja päevast ja päeva kodukorrast veel rääkides, siis sõnaõigus on meil kõigil olemas. Mul oleks hea meel, kui me küsimused, oma mõtted ja ettepanekud reserveeriksime ettekannete lõpuossa, kus siis on võimalik juba saalist märku andes enese juurde ka mikrofon tellida ja siis ka oma seisukohad välja öelda. Aga ma julgen niimoodi ette pisut ahendada jututeemasid ja juhtida tähelepanu, et me võiksime oma seisukohtade väljaütlemiste kõlama panemise juures jääda tänase teema piiresse ja mitte valguda kõikide nende väga emotsionaalsete teemade juurde, mis haridusega seotud on, eks ju. Et me saaksime tänast päeva efektiivselt ära kasutada. Ma arvan, et esimese ringina manitsussõnadest on see kõik. Lubage asuda päevaplaani täitmise juurde. Enne 2 ettekannet ma paluksin tänase päeva sisulist ja ka vormilist poolt lahti seletama kõigepealt Lelo Liive, Eesti Koostöö Kogu projektijuhi, kes on mehist, julgen kasutada siin sellist sõna vaeva näinud terve aasta jooksul selleks, et see tänane üritus siin sisulisena toimuda saaks. Palun teile.
Aitäh. Eile õhtul, kui ma läksin oma raamaturiiuli juurde, siis hakkasin minna silma 2 raamatut. Üks neist on meile eestlastele kõigile väga tuttav Aabits. See on väga kaksaks loetud juba selleks, et sellest on väga paljud lapsed õppinud. Ja sellest hakatakse õppima 7 aastaselt. Teine raamat on see, millest ma õppisin ülikoolis, mille pealkiri on kõrgema matemaatika ülesannete kogu. See ei ole nii kapsas. Seda ei loe igaüks. Aga kui mõelda seda, et see on eluperiood, mis on vanuse 7 ja 23, 25, 30 ja midagi veel vahel, siis iga inimese elu on palju pikem. Kui me 2009. aastal moodustasime haridusfoorumi ja haridusministeeriumiga partnerluse, et välja töötada haridusstrateegia projekt, siis me seadsime eesmärgiks inimese elukvaliteedi parandamise, inimesele võimaluse läbi oma hariduse leida endale koht maailmas, saavutada sotsiaalseid oskusi. Kui me aasta tagasi moodustasime uue partnerluse sihtasutusega Innove, ajalehtede kirjastuse, haridusministeeriumi ja kommunikatsioonibüroo Powerhouse'iga, siis seadsime me endale eesmärgiks leida lahendusi, kuidas see haridusstrateegia oleks võimalik ellu viia ja leida tõestusi, et mis on need tõelised valupunktid, piirid ja takistused. Mul on väga hea meel kohtuda jälle kord siin nende inimestega, kellega me kohtusime viimase 2-3 kuu jooksul oma 4000 kilomeetrise maratoni jooksul. Mul on väga hea meel näha siin neid eksperte, kes käisid ja rääkisid teile oma teadmistest. Täna on kokkuvõtete tegemise aeg ja jõudu tänaseks päevaks. Ja nüüd ma annaksingi sõna edasi avamise jaoks Koostöö Kogu juhatuse esimehele Peep Mühlsile ja temale järgnevalt professor Mati Heidmetsale, kes on olnud strateegia juhtiv autor.
Austatud osalised, lugupeetud eksperdid, head kolleegid, daamid ja härrad. Viimastel nädalatel ja kuudel on hästi palju räägitud sellest, et valitsejad peaksid rohkem kuulama seda, mida nende valijad, mida Eesti inimesed, Eesti kodanikud ootavad. Tuletame siin väga reljeefselt meelde siin mõni nädala tagust aktat ja vaatame, millega lõppesse palju räägitud järgmisel nädalal välja kuulutatud õpetajate streik. Aga see kõneleb millest? See kõneleb sellest, et see ühiskond on küps, et need inimesed tegelikult tahaksid aruteludes kaasa lüüa, mis otsustavad nende tulevikku, nende käekäiku. Me ei lähe ju rääkima igast peenest detailist, kus on vaja ekspertanalüüse, ei soovi inimesed nendest sõna võtta, sellest me oleme valinud nii kompetentsed ametnikud, aga eelkõige oma rahvaesindajad Riigikokku. Aga on olemas teemad, lisaks tervishoiule, kindlasti väga oluline teema, haridus, kus inimesed tunnevad, et läbi nende endi, läbi nende laste või lastelaste, nad tegelikult kujundavad Eesti tulevikku. Ja selles kontekstis, ma ei tea, kas te nõustute minuga, minu arvates on Eesti riik jõudnud sellesse küpsuse etappi, kus meil ei ole vaja enam tegelikult neid juba ettevalmistatud seaduseelnõusid, ettevalmistatud strateegiaid, mida kutsutakse nii-öelda kaasama või osalema, tulge arutame, näeme midagi siin sai valmis, tulge arutame ja siis me läheme valitsuses või Riigikogus sees otsustamisele. On olemas asjad, nii nagu ka see, millest me täna räägime, haridusstrateegia 2020, kus tegelikult väga palju need huvitatud osapooled ise tahavad hakata rääkima, läbi sõeluma teemasid ja välja pakkuma neid otsustajatele. Selles kontekstis on see haridusstrateegia 2020 ja sellele jätkuvalt nüüd see Elukestva õppe projekt kahtlemata suhteliselt unikaalse tähendusega. See sai alguse 2007. aastal. 2008. aastal koostöös juba Eesti haridusfoorumiga me esitasime Riigikogus olulise riikliku küsimuse arutelu vormis selle ettepaneku, et Eesti võiks olla selline pikem visioon 60 peale, kuhu Eesti haridus eeldada meie alus põhihariduses ja jätkuvalt, kuhu elukaare jooksul inimese haridus tegelikult Eestis suundub. Milline on see üldsuund, millise valikud me teeme? Teades on meie rahvastik väheneb ja vaneb. Aastat 2008 on nüüd möödas juba 3,5 aastat. Selle aja jooksul on valminud haridusstrateegia 2020. Me kohtusime väga paljudega teist eelmise aasta maikuuses, kus me rääkisime läbi selle lõpplausleid ja 29. juunil sai see haridusstrateegia dokument ka kavandina ettepanekuna haridus- ja teadusministrile üle võetud. 31. jaanuariks töötas välja grupp eksperte samasugusel kolmepoolsel koostööl haridusfoorumiga, haridus- ja teadusministeeriumi ja Eesti Koostöö Kogu eestvedamisel töötas välja ametliku ettepaneku ministrile, mille minister loodetavasti lähinädalatel, lähikuudel esitab Vabariigi Valitsusele ettepanekuna välja töötada, vormistada ja kinnitada veel selle aastal Eesti haridusstrateegia 2020. Selles kontekstis on tänane konverents väga olulise tähendusega, sest nii nagu mu kolleeg juba seda ütles, on läbitud 1000 kilomeetreid, on läbitud kõikides maakondades arutelud teemadel, mis teile, mis meile, mis meie tulevikul on tähtsad. Ja ma loodan siiralt, et kui üks inimpõlv on Eesti taasiseseisvumisest möödunud, siis selle ajaga on hakanud muutuma ja muutub tulevikus üha enam ka meie otsustajate suhtumine sellesse, milline on Eesti riigi kodanikuühenduste roll oluliste riiklike strateegiate kujundamisel. Mitte enam ülevalt alla, vaid ka altpoolt ülesse. Mitte ettekirjutatud materjal, vaid see, mis inimestele tähtis, mida nad läbi arutanud, mida nad on tsiviliseeritud korras ja mida tänaval karjudes esitanud oma otsustajatele läbi arutamiseks, poliitiliste otsuste tegemiseks, eelarve prioriteetide arvestamiseks. See on tegelikult meie kõnetus täna meie otsustajatele meie valdsel. Näeme, kas meid võetakse kuulda. Ma loodan, et see tõesti on. Aitäh ja edukat tänast päeva.
Tere hommikust. Mina ei esinda praegu siin ühtegi asutust ega organisatsiooni. Ma tervitan teid rahva poolt. See tänane konverents on, ma arvan, tähelepanuväärne vähemalt kahest plaanis. Nii selle sisu mõttes kui ka vormi mõttes. Me oleme harjunud elukestvast õppest rääkima tavaliselt sel viisil, et see on millelegi lisandus. Et on koolieelne õppe ja on siis gümnaasiumiõppe ja on kõrgkooliõppe ja siis on veel mingi elukestev. Meie selle tänase konverentsi pealkiri on piiride nihutamine ja ma arvan, et üks piir, mis peaks liikuma, ja ta tasapisi juba liikub, aga mitte võib-olla piisavalt, peaks liikuma meie peades. See on arusaam sellest, mida see elukestev õpe tähendab. See ei ole lisaks kõikidele muudele, vaid see on see kõik kokku. Ja võib-olla veel midagi natuke lisaks. Tegelikult on see mõtteviis, tegelikult on see elulaad. Ja laiemas mõttes see on tegelikult ka iga riigi ja rahva arenguressurss. Mida rohkem on meil inimesi, kellel siin väike lamp kogu aeg põleb ja see väike lamp sunnib targemaks saada, uurida midagi, lugeda, konverentsidel käia. Mida rohkem neid inimesi on, seda tegelikult võimelisem on üks ühiskond kohanema selle kiiresti muutuva maailma. Ma arvan, sellise väikese ühiskonna nagu Eesti jaoks on sellel arenguressursid õppimisel, elukestev õppimisel, kui arenguressursid veel üks lisatähendus. See on see instrument, millega me väga sageli saame hoida neid inimesi, kes sellest turuõikluses on hakanud natuke kõrvale jääma, välja kukkuma. Hoida neid nii-öelda mängus sees ja neid uuesti tagasi tuua sellesse pärisühiskonna Eesti ellu. Ja väikese ühiskonna jaoks on see väga tähtis asi. See tänane üritus on, ma arvan, tähtis ka tähelepanuväärne ka selle vormi mõttes, nii nagu juba Peep rääkis, see on looline asi. Kogu see tegevus, mida Koostöö Kogu on hariduse vallas viimastel aastatel ette võtnud, on minu arvates hästi tänuväärne ja tähelepanuväärne. See on initsiatiiv ja mõtlemine ja tegutsemine, mis ei ole kuskilt ülevalt ette kirjutatud. See tuleb kuskilt siit alt. Ja see, et eelmisel aastal sai valmis juba räägitud haridusstrateegia kavand, praegu me arutame, ma arvan, kõige mastaapsemat, hakkame arutama kõige mastaapsemat pilti Eesti elukestvast õppest, mis asi see Eesti kontekstis täna tegelikult tähendab. Ja see kõik on tulnud ühiskonnast endast. See tegelikult näitab, et Eesti ühiskond on piisavalt küps tõsiseid teemasid ise ette võtma ja läbi rääkima ja olema ka konstruktiivne ja samas ka kriitiline partner riigile nendes küsimustes. Arvan, et see on väga tähtis asi. See võiks meile sellist kindlustunnet anda. Meil on see mõte ja arusaam juba piisavalt küps, et me oleme kõik koos ja ka üksikud rühmitused eraldi piisavalt targad selleks, et Eesti arengu jaoks tähtsates küsimustes kaasa rääkida. Ma soovin meile kõigile sisukat mõttevahetust ja hoidke kogu aeg meeles, et see, mis me tegelikult teeme, on oluliselt tähtsam kui see, mis seal praegu välja paistab. Aitäh!
suur aitäh väikese häälestuse osas ja ma usun, et Mati Heidmets sõnastas nagu väga täpselt ära selle, mis protsessid ühiskonnas käivad ja ma sain selle sissejuhatuse käigus aru ka, miks mind siia kutsuti. Ajakirjanik on ju väga hea lõpuspaber, kas silm sära või ei sära, kui silm ei sära, siis tõenäoliselt ta ei saa aru, eks ju. Ja kui särama hakkab, siis järelikult saab milleski aru ja on lootus teistele ka edasi anda. Nii et püüan indikeerida kuidagi adekvaatselt. Aga läheme esimeste ettekannete juurde, et ilmselgelt ei leiutame ju päriselt jalgratast ja Eesti ei ole, nii palju kui me ka ei tahaks, ei ole üksik saar kusagil keset ookeani, vaid need asjad, millest meie räägime praegu, võivad olla kõneaineks ka praegu paljudes kohtades, aga võib samamoodi oletada, et neist teemadest on ühes ja teises kohas räägitud. Meil on täna 2 suurepärast näidet, olles juba eelolevat presentatsioone pisut sirvinud. Riikidest, mis nii mitmeski mõttes võiksid võib-olla olla kas eeskujuks või võiksid olla meile oma ideede väljatöötamisel tuttavad. Ja esimene neist näidetest puudutab nii-öelda lähtepunktina Norrat, sest ettekandja, kes teie ette tuleb, on ühe uurimisettevõtte praegu omanik ja siis ka juhtiv konsultant, selle nimi on Konsultor. Ja see firma on siis tegenud 1994. aastast peale juba erinevate analüüside, strateegiate läbikaalumisega ja seda just sageli või peamiselt siis Euroopa Liidu programmide, erinevate programmide kontekstis, mis ju ka on meie jaoks täpselt samamoodi selline väga oluline paljude projektide läbiviimise ja lähtepositsioon. Bjørn Ure, palun, Norrast.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me in the background? So the mic is working. Good. I'm very glad to be here, to be invited by the Estonian Corporation Assembly to this conference. I haven't been in Tallinn since I took part at a conference, an inaugural conference, nearly 7 years ago, held by the Estonian University that was in the frame of a project which I will base very much on my speech about. I'd like to, well, first you see that I have added a subtitle to the national construction of lifelong learning. That is the national policies and European influences. So I will try to conclude with the interaction between what's happening at a national level and at an EU level. Then I start out by speaking about the origins and definitions of lifelong learning. And then at the start, at the European level, it is important to notice that the inclusion of education and training policies happened at a quite late stage in comparison with the inaugural Rome Treaty and so on. It was not before the early 1980s that the European Commission got enough power to initiate a cooperation in the field of training, mostly industrial renewal. And it was not before the Maastricht 1999 treaty that the European Commission got permission from the member states to cooperate in the field of education. Before that, there was only very meager cooperation in the frame of changes of teachers and students. But the political cooperation in the field of education did not start before the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. And both researchers and all kind of observers of the European Union think that the reason for this late inclusion of education and training policies come from the fact that, especially education, the education system is considered very close to the national identity, so it is difficult to hand over power to the European institutions in order to start cooperation in the field of education particularly, but also training, which arrived very late also on the European agenda. But then, in the mid-1990s, there was even a European year for lifelong learning. And after that, the European Commission started working on a memorandum on lifelong learning. But it was approved in the year 2000 as a working paper for the European Commission. It was not handed over to the European Parliament or to the European Council. It remained as a kind of internal working document, which most likely come from the fact that there was not possible 12 years ago to agree on a very binding agenda for lifelong learning at the European level. But today we see that there is a stronger understanding inside the European Union, inside or between the member states, to measure progress towards the lifelong learning targets, which were first established for year 2010 and now then for 2020. And the Commission has then got over to measure or to supervise the extent to which the member states move towards these targets. And in addition, the open method of policy coordination is being used in order to measure this national progress also, so that there is a kind of comparison between the member states in order to reach those targets, and also a kind of not necessarily competition towards being the best pupil, but at least a kind of transparency when it comes to the extent to which the targets are being met. It is also important to notice that the European agenda for lifelong learning is increasingly influenced also by what's happening in OECD, because there is now a stronger collaboration between the European Commission and OECD in terms of setting targets and defining benchmarks for education and training, and also for lifelong learning. The definition of lifelong learning, which formed part of the memorandum from year 2000, is quite wide, as you will see. Lifelong learning is said to encompass all purposeful learning activity, whether formal or informal, undertaken on an ongoing basis, with the aim of improving knowledge, skills, and competences. But in addition, it's important to look back to what also was happening in the early 1970s, in the frame of UNESCO. because they started work on lifelong learning education already at that time, and then lifelong learning education was initially defined, and they issued a 2005 document, which you can see the reference for at the back of my presentation. But in 2005 they had then elaborated the definition to say that lifelong learning entails the transforming, redistributing and reharmonizing of individual and social periods of learning, and then encompassing pre-primary education, basic school education, after compulsory schooling, continuing training, and after working life. And this definition illustrates that both the individual and collective aspects of learning forms part of lifelong learning education, and also the integration of education levels is important in order to understand the meaning of lifelong learning. And this definition also brings to the forefront the balance between schooling and working life. So if we then look jointly at the EU definition and the UNESCO definition, we can say that lifelong learning covers all school trajectories, but goes beyond the educational system as such. The concept is, as you see, very ambitious, very broad. Lifelong learning becomes in the center of the entire social system, and then there is a danger that lifelong learning becomes a very easy catchword. And we often see in the lifelong learning discourse that the implications of lifelong learning are not very clear-cut. So I will try to clarify the notion of lifelong learning by looking then at lifelong learning between national policies and European influences. But first, I will try to show the composition of lifelong learning in the sense that when looking back at the standard EU definition which I showed you, lifelong learning has a wider scope than adult education because lifelong learning also encompasses initial education. For example, the crucial question of how the initial education system is able to prepare young students for a lifelong learning trajectory. And then the question arises on what is the relationship between lifelong learning and continuing education and further education. First, there is no standard English definition which is able to discriminate after continuing education and further education. So, as shown here, they have overlapping dimensions. Further education and continuing education relate to adult education in the sense that they touch upon aspects which are not only part of adult education, but then it is part of this wider circle, which is lifelong learning. So lifelong learning is the most general concept here, and in principle it should cover, it should comprise all the other educational forms: initial education, adult education, continuing education, and further education. a bit more about adult education, because that has been in the center of the meetings which have been held at the regional level in Estonia, as far as I've understood, during the recent months. Could we say that adult education is an institution? First, well, what is meant by an institution? It can be a very strict definition by saying that an institution denotes an organization with staff guided by a mission. A more loose concept might be that an institution is a set of practices and arrangements between social actors leading to some form of collective action. And then a more academic definition is that institution denotes complex social forms that reproduce themselves, such as government, the family, human languages, universities, hospitals, business corporations, and legal systems. And then the question arises, are particular adult education practices institutionalized to the extent that there is an adult education system? And as you saw on the last slide, I tend to say yes, that adult education is institutionalized. It is institutionalized, I would say, also in a way which is there is a stronger institutionalization of adult education than of lifelong learning, because adult education has been a part of education policies for a longer time than lifelong learning. And then I will briefly move to a discussion about lifelong learning as a system. And I will do that by pointing to the work which I've done together with the Institute for International and Social Studies at the Tallinn universities, then in the frame of a project which has been named Lifelong Learning 2010 towards the Lifelong Learning Society in Europe, the contribution of the education system. One diagnosis which we formulated during our research going on for more than 5 years was that the current comparative research on lifelong learning usually covers characteristics of the welfare state, the labor market, the education systems, and also signs of an emerging lifelong learning system at national or European level. But what is meant by a system, after having taken you through some definition of an institution? A system is normally considered to be something more stable than an institution, and a definition of a system, a loose one, can be that it is an act of systematic thinking resulting in coherent planning, whereas a more strict definition would be that a system denotes institutions that have survived a certain historic period during which they developed interdependent relations. And what we did was then in a project Lifelong Learning 2010 to look for elements which pertain to the system, and we did that by looking at structures in national education, in training, in the labor market. That means that we look for structures that could point to the emergence of a national lifelong learning system. in the 13 countries which were covered by the project. Also, we look for factors behind lifelong learning on our way to identify the systemic elements, and the first one is the broader economic and social context, also the welfare state regimes, the labor market, the system of initial education, and finally the skill formation system, which denotes then the intersections between the labor market and the education system. I've put on this illustration some pairs of dimensions illustrating lifelong learning. Each line illustrates, in principle, 2 dimensions of lifelong learning: formal learning, informal learning, individual learning, collective learning, employability, citizenship, the state and the civil society. It is important to note that you should not read any horizontal line here, because no horizontal link is intended. But these dimensions, and also I have to point out that these dimensions are not necessarily opposites, which means that non-formal learning can be placed in the middle of formal and informal learning, and then illustrating a kind of continuum. And also the employability and citizenship are probably 2 separate dimensions. These dimensions together reflect the tensions with regard to learning, work, leisure, and community life. Now my third part of the presentation, which concerns lifelong learning policies and strategies, may be closer to the regional conferences which you have been through during the last months here in Estonia. And I base myself on a report which I did together with some colleagues for the DG Education and Culture belonging to the European Commission. One of the conclusions in that report is that during the national constructions of lifelong learning, policies should first facilitate the transition and progression across education and training subsystems or different forms of learning. So again, we assume that lifelong learning is a general notion consisting of different subsystems. And secondly, address more than one education and training subsystem. For example, policies that combine adult learning and child learning. And thirdly, then, make sure that learners develop the right competence sets and attitudes to engage in learning throughout their life. In addition, then, we identify 6 critical factors for implementing lifelong learning strategies and policies. The first one is to tackle the interests of relevant stakeholders by involvement, cooperation, and consensus building. Secondly, to implement adequate financing mechanisms, to develop institutions, to develop infrastructure and institutional capacity for adequate provision of lifelong learning, attracting learners towards learning activities. Fifth, to promote adapted design of learning initiatives according to specific target groups, and then finally to guarantee the existence of a feedback loop and a kind of policy memory for continuing improvement of lifelong learning. On this illustration, I try to sum up the previous points about lifelong learning policies and strategies. Then I assume that the criteria and critical factors which I presented to you on the previous slides can then be clustered around three constituting elements of lifelong learning, that is the people, policies, and system. And then, starting with people, the recruitment of learners most in need is very relevant there. The adapted design according to target groups. Likewise, then the competence sets and attitudes for learning till the end of your life concern mostly people. Then the elements which have to do with the system are the infrastructure and the institutional capacity. Stakeholders mostly belong to the system, but certainly there are also stakeholders in policies. But then the transgression and progression between educational levels and subsystems, like between initial VET and continuing VET system, that are systemic elements which belong to where it is placed now. Whereas then the policies, the feedback loops, the financial mechanisms, they partly form part of the system and of the policies. And then finally, as you show in the right corner at the top of this illustration, then the integration of policy initiatives between labor market, school training, between adult learning, university policy, that is an element which primarily belongs then to policies. I will now come to the national construction of lifelong learning and EU influence. The last part of my presentation, which then comes back to what I said initially about the intersection between what's happening at the national level and at a European level. And I will do that on the basis of the three constituting elements of lifelong learning which I showed to you on the illustration. One key topic related to people in order to understand the intersection between national level and EU level is how adult education plays out in a civil society in terms of learning that sustains local belonging and other citizenship perspectives. And as you see on the last line, there are EU policies that intervene or are being used in order to strengthen this dimension. You have the Grundtvig program, which I know quite a few Estonian partners have been involved in. And you have also certain actions of the Jean Monnet program, which stimulates the cooperation, for example, between European organizations which are involved in educational training, but that do not necessarily have education and training as their prime objective, and I'm sure that the organizer of this conference would be eligible for taking part in German actions. And then you have the collective learning traditions versus the individual learning styles, which form partly part of the national characteristics of lifelong learning. You have the study circles, which have been important in many Nordic countries. And you have the conciliation of work life and family life, which is important, which can be then supported both from national sources and from EU sources. There is much concern about, at EU level about the changing age structure. And then, yes, I think that's where the points I'd like to raise concerning people. I then move to the policies in the framework of the intersection between nations and the EU. First, the models and sources of inspiration when defining a lifelong learning policy partly comes from what's happening at the national level, and also partly comes from, yes, when regions in Estonia learn from each other. I would call it then national examples. And also there are comparisons and exchange of experiences organized by the European Union in this regard. The funding of these activities are important, and the member states use a mixture of national and EU funding, partly supported by the European Social Fund, partly supported by the existing lifelong learning program, Jean Monnet, Grundtvig, and so on. And also here the utilization of EU policy instruments like the open method of cooperation, and how the differences between member states with regard to using these instruments. There is a tendency that old member states having a very consolidated training system, that they do not necessarily want to learn too much from other member states because they consider that they have already moved into a good path which should not necessarily be reformed according to an EU agenda. And then at the national level, member states have the opportunity, in principle at least, to make some choices with regard to which subsystems of lifelong learning or educational training that should be reformed, and also the extent to which smooth passage between educational levels and educational tracks should be allowed. Should a student pass very smoothly from a vocational track to an educational track, or should there be more distinguished paths in the education system? That is something to discuss. Whereas, as you know, the kind of standard lifelong learning thinking is that everything should be very changeable, people should move around, and you should not punish a student who by second opinion would like to start another program. So this kind of fluidity between education level subsystems, that is something which forms part of the lifelong learning agenda at the European level, which is difficult to implement at the national level, and the extent to which the member states move towards a kind of lifelong learning paradigm depend partly on whether this smooth passages is being implemented at the national level. And then in the future, the redefinition of the EU programs and the European Social Fund guidelines will then determine how the interaction will happen then. At the system level then, with regard to the interaction between nations and EU, both lifelong learning and the older notion like adult education is being shaped by historical heritage. And in the project Lifelong Learning 2010, which I spoke about, we had the privilege of having many of the former post-Soviet and post-socialist states as partners. So I will illustrate this point by referring to some of their experiences, starting with Bulgaria, which then after 1989, their new forms of lifelong learning, like the vocational training centers for qualification and requalification, were put in place, and these now coexist with own institutions in a very hybrid system of lifelong learning. In Slovenia, the adult education structures and institutions did not change in a way after the democratization, which facilitated access to formal education for adults. The improvement in Slovenia was very much concentrated on access to non-formal education. And then in Lithuania, then in 1992, the government probably announced that the education system then was based already on European cultural values. And after the European Commission Memorandum of Lifelong Learning was adopted in the year 2000, then they managed to smoothly install a system of formal and non-formal education, and which then primarily reformed the provision of adult education. Yes. And after lunch, we might hear what is happening in Estonia, or what has happened in Estonia in this regard since the 1990s. I'd like to show an example to you of how existing national and regional characteristics can be seen against the background of possible transformations inspired by EU policy. And I will do that by referring very briefly to an analysis of a VET reform, vocational education training in Spain, 2008. This roadmap reform then continued working primarily with information, advice, and guidance in integrated centers for VET. They used extensively money from the European Social Fund because money from that fund is often used in order to build up infrastructure, whereas member states use money from the lifelong learning program in order to develop educational content. So, but these physical institutions, the physical centers, they were funded by means of money from the European Social Fund. And in Spain, since 2008, we see that several national developments, like setting up of a national qualification framework, a system of the validation of non-formal and informal learning, refer to the EU policy framework. However, the actual design of the new VET instruments and structures, like these integrated centers, they primarily resulted from national compromises between regional authorities, trades and social partners. So it was very clear that the policy at EU level in this regard was an important background, but it had no immediate impact for the actual design of the new VET centers that were developed and modified in Spain. And as you will show on this last slide, we think in a project Lifelong Learning 2010 that this Spanish example is quite characteristic in the sense that the diversity of national context means that a single model of lifelong learning across the European Union is very unlikely. While a common policy may be encouraged by the EU and may lead to significant national policy developments, these will be strongly influenced by institutional, political, social and ideological factors at a national level. And although the countries are influenced by the EU, they will consciously or unconsciously pick and choose between different EU priorities. That was something which we wrote in the executive summary in the final report, which you can download from an internet address at the top of this list of selected references, which has been handed out to you. And here is my contact details, and I think that I've now used my time, so I thank you for your attention.
Küsimusteks palun, kui keegi soovib selle suure info koguse peale kohe esitada, palun küsimust, mis puudutab siis sedasama Euroopa Liidu kogemuse konteksti. Palun ühte küsimust. Näen, võime küsida eesti keeles, püüame siis tõlkida.
Te rääkisite nüüd sellest Elukestva õppimise süsteemist, näitajatest, formaalsest struktuurist, kui mitte midagi selle sisust. Tegelikult võib ju see struktuur funktsioneerida, inimesed võivad kuskil õppida, aga midagi nad nagu targemaks ei saa. Näiteks kui me vaatame sellist asja nagu kodanikud kompetentsid või demokraatia haridus, siis kui nad koolis ei omandanud oskust seda demokraatia probleemi mõista, siis nad võivad ka elu lõpuni käia mingites kursustes ja mingit arengut ei toimu. Ja kui ka Euroopa Liidus pole mingisuguseid ühtseid seisukohti, siis selline elukestev õppesüsteem ei vii ju tegelikult kuhugi. Et küsimus on selles, et tegelikult see elukestev õppesüsteem peaks olema seostatud ka mingite selliste kvalitatiivsete näitajatega, muutustega inimeste teadmistes ja haridustasemes.
ma võin kuidagi kokku võtta niimoodi, et küsimus on selles, et kas elukestva õppeprotsessid on seotud mingite kvalitatiivsete näitajatega Euroopas.
Kas sellega seoses muutub haridus? Mõõdetakse, hinnatakse?
See lõpu küsimuse osa, kes ma saan aru, on kõige olulisem. Palun.
Should I comment on that now, or are there more interventions which I should... Well, I agree that there is a danger that we concentrate on the structures and also that the content is important. Whether the European Union as such can define a kind of lifelong learning framework which is important for the democratic values in all member states. That's possible that, well, you have that at a more broader European level, the European Declaration of Human Rights and so on, so which is being then supervised by the Council of Europe, which is then is extended beyond the European Union. I think that what the European Union here can do, but that's my opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of the European Commission as such, although I do some work for them. What the European Commission can do is using these projects and programs in order to allow partners in European countries to come together in a project where you can define these values, these democratic values, which is then put into the content of education, which you say, which is put into the curriculum. But I don't think that the curriculum as such can be defined at a European level. I think that it has been developed from below, and what can come from the European Union as such is a kind of principles at a very broad level. So the agreement or what is put into the curriculum more comes from the national education systems, which then can sum up the experiences, for example, from Estonian partners having been involved in citizenship actions financed by the European Union. I don't know if that responded to your comment or...
Ja ma usun, et ka sisuliste näidetele me saame kohe lähemale juba järgmise ettekandega. Kas nende tehniliste andmete ja näidete kohta, kuidas Euroopas asjadele lähenetakse, selles osas soovib veel keegi küsimust praegu? Kui mitte, sellisel juhul ma soovin tänada esinejat. Thank you. Ja selles mõttes oli see vett näide väga huvitav Hispaania kontekstis, sest tegelikult sarnasele lähenemisele või sarnast olukorda me tutvustame nüüd ka Suurbritannia kontekstis, kus nüüd ütleme praktiliselt kogu järgmise ettekande peamine mõte sellest räägib ja just Suurbritannia kogemust siis selle osas, mismoodi haridussüsteem liigub kaasa ameti ja ettevõtete vajadustega ja kuidas toimub õppe siis asutustes, firmades. Ja professor Costley Inglismaalt, Middlesexi ülikoolist, kes on selle küsimusega ja tegelenud pikemat aega, on järgmisena teie sõna.
Okay, hello everybody. This first slide is a picture of the atrium in Middlesexi University, which is based in North London, and covered in glass in quite a nice venue where the students all sit, with cafes and so on. Just thought you'd like to feel the context of my background, which is in the Institute for Work-Based Learning, which is sits alongside the schools, the four major schools in Middlesex University. It's quite a large international university with campuses in London, Dubai and Mauritius now, and also we have offices around the world. So we, especially in the Institute, like to think that we have this international perspective and that we're operating in a truly global thinking society, if you like. So I'd like to start off with the premise of my presentation being to consider the wider, bigger picture of employment, education and training in our society. And just to sort of take a bigger picture snap of the difference between education and training and what that could possibly mean. Actually, picking up a little bit from what the last questioner was talking about. Because I think there's an unnecessary divide between educational and occupational standards. The way we classify and frame things is important. And we know we have to do it. We have to classify things, we have to frame them in order for them to be workable, in order for people to understand what we're talking about. But in so doing, we often then start constructing things in a way which is then unhelpful. So I think higher education has a lot to offer in reminding people that we should be always drawing connections. And even the subject disciplines themselves have done this, subject disciplines which have evolved hundreds of years ago. Are they now still helpful in the way that we think about the way we do our work, for example? Today's society requires autonomous workers. Our organisations have flatter structures. They need capability as well as competency. And just to flag up before I start the presentation properly, I'll be talking about employability, which is people before they go to work, young people usually, before they start on the road to work, and what you might call employee learning, continuing professional development, lifelong learning, however you want to think about it. Sometimes, and kind of conflating them in some of the ideas that come up, because sometimes they apply to one, sometimes to the other, and sometimes to both. So I'm thinking not key skills necessarily that people need to be good employees, but how to learn, what is expected of people at work, what is emotional intelligence and how does that fit into the way we conduct our working lives? What kind of work ethic is expected of people? What kind of life ethic might people have? So education should really reflect the society we live in. Education has been notoriously slow to do that. We know we're a slow-moving area of our society. And employers, for example, who are a fast-moving area, can get a little bit frustrated with us. But nevertheless, we need to, we're a service, we need to reflect the society that we live in. The reason that these issues are coming up is because there's a perceived skills gap in society. A skills gap where, especially at the lower level of learning and skills and abilities, there are huge swathes of people who are unemployed, and yet there's work for them to do, but they're not capable of doing it. And that's a very simplistic kind of notion that you'd think that we could then simplistically move towards to meet those needs. But that is not necessarily how things have gone, and I'm going to tell you just a brief, necessarily outline story of what happened in the UK. So we've had this narrow interpretation of societal needs. Distinctions between education and skills, as I said, may not be helpful in defining what we mean by broad sets of abilities in generalised areas. But then the distinctions have become unhelpful when they're boundaried, fixed. It disinclines people to think out of the box, which is what we need people to do. So it's not in the best interest of an advanced, knowledge-based economy. Competencies also needs to come with a degree of thinking skills. Our education systems need to reflect society, building in a range of abilities, providing opportunities for people to progress across the facets of abilities so that people can reach their potential in the area that they wish to work and study. Meeting national economic imperatives and meeting the needs of communities. There's been a very narrow distinction about what work means, work itself. There's a distinction, for example, between paid work and all other kinds of work and life. We are, after all, whole people. We bring our whole selves to our work. And if you have some abilities and skills which you happen to have got from somewhere other than a training course or education, you're going to put them into play if you need to during your working life. You gain skills from working in the community, from the domestic sphere, from the voluntary sphere. I've taken, for example, a couple of extracts of a research report which was interviewing young people. The first one, we were talking to someone in a university aged 20 and asking him what his background was and what skills he was bringing to the university. And the interviewer asked him if he had any foreign language skills. Had he learnt anything at school, for example, the person thought. So he said no. He said, I was really bad. I did French at school, but I wasn't very good at it, and I didn't. They didn't even bother putting me in for the exam. So no, I don't have any language skills. On further probing with this young man, it discovered that actually he came from an Indian background and he was fluent in Hindi. But because he hadn't learnt it at school, he didn't really think that was important. That wasn't what the interviewer wanted to know, so he didn't even tell him. The second example is similar. Was a young woman who had her CV with only sort of basic things on it, what she'd done at school and so on and so forth. Again, a 21-year-old at university, and she was being asked by the interviewer about her employment experience. Many young people do part-time work now, things like that. And she said she hadn't got any employment experience. But then, again, on further questioning, they found out that her parents owned a restaurant. She worked in the restaurant on a part-time basis. And then sometimes when her parents went on holiday, she ran the restaurant. So she also had this whole swathe of business skills, supplying, dealing with suppliers and so on and so forth. But, you know, because it wasn't paid employment, something she could say she worked somewhere else and so on and so forth, she hadn't said that she had those abilities. And that, I put it to you, is because that's how we construct things, by making these unnecessary boundaries. So there's a complexity. And I'd even go as far to say a super complexity in the way our society works at the moment. People in paid employment now go on to be portfolio workers. More and more people don't have full-time jobs for life. They do part-time work, a bit here, a bit there. They act as consultants, especially at the higher level. Things do not drop easily into boxes. There's a complexity. And we're looking at things like feedback loops between employers and the educators and trainers, and how that works, how the world of employment feeds into us what their needs are. And this needs a more qualitative approach to find out what those needs are. It's not going to be understood by educators simply by very simplistic methods. Not that we always conduct simplistic methods at all, there are qualitative approaches, but on the whole I'm suggesting that. So the story in the UK was that we have these national vocational qualifications. We've had them for a long time. More recently, they've been brought into play to meet the skills gap, and they range from level 1, which is what in our system you might do at the age of 16, to level 5, which is equivalent to around about the second year of a bachelor's degree. There's not so many level 5 ones, they're mostly at the management end of things. They're based on national standards in various different occupational groups. They tend to be functional, competence-based, and they measure tangible outcomes, often on the job. So, for example, just to take a very simple example, changing an electric plug. Someone might be asked at a very low level, can they do it, is what the MVQ wants to know. Or part of the MVQ question is, can this person do it? So they will be observed, the assessor will observe the person performing the act, and they will have a list of criteria there. Do they know which colour wire goes in which part of the plug? Yes. When they put the plug back together, have they screwed it up nice and tightly so it's functional? Yes. So you can't go wrong if you're the assessor, really. It's very, very clear. But it doesn't ask things like, why should you change the plug in the first place? How can we tell if there's something wrong? Or even, should we have these kind of plugs where you can change them? Shouldn't we have the moulded plugs like they have in the rest of Europe, which are much safer? It doesn't sort of press people to have that bigger picture, ask the question, and so on. So the MVQs were introduced in the early 1990s. They now address the perceived skills gap in the UK and the low-level skills compared with other major Western competitors. They're the product of a shift from supply-led to demand-led vocational education and training, focusing on enhancing the employability of individuals on the basis of employers' skills needs. As a result, these awards tend to be narrow, focusing on the job function rather than on a profession. The idea is to allow individuals to pick up and combine different competencies according to the needs of the labour market. So you can take them as an introduction before you start work, and you can take them as lifelong learning whilst you're still working. There's possibilities for both. The Sector Skills Councils are state-sponsored, employer-led organisations covering special economic sectors in Britain. Their key goals are to reduce the skills gap and shortages, to improve productivity, to boost the skills of their sector workforces, to improve learning supply, including apprenticeships and higher education. The Sector Skills Councils increase the opportunity to boost the skills and productivity of everyone in each sector's workforce. They improve learning supply, including apprenticeships, higher education and national occupational standards. To operate, the Sector Skills Councils have to be licensed by the Secretary of State for Education and Skills. And following criteria are considered in this licensing. So first of all, they have to have the direct backing of key employers and employment interests, including small firms in the sector. So you can't set up a Sector Skills Council unless you've got the backing of employers. So this was a real big move to get employers more involved in skills training at this level. There have to be influential employer leadership through board level, representation from across the sector and throughout the UK. They have significant financial contributions from the sector to secure the sector's priority. And this is the government, our government, for a long time now, trying to get employers to contribute financially to the education and training they want for their workforce. And in the sector skills councils, they do that. Professional staff and expertise to command the respect and wider involvement of employers. They're very careful who they choose to run the sector skills council. They have to have credibility and capability to influence and coordinate action to meet sector skills priorities, and the capacity to operate effectively throughout the UK, taking account of the responsibilities of the devolved administrations, regional development agencies in England and other publicly funded bodies in their sector. Sector skills councils achieve these aims by contributing to the development of national occupational standards. The UK Commission for Employment and Skills supports 25 sector skills councils, which cover 85% of the British workforce. Functions and tasks needed for each occupational area are delineated with performance indicators at each level. They map out what skills employers in each sector need their workforce to have and how these skills will be supplied now and in the future. Agreements, sector skills agreements, are facilitated by the network of employer-led sector skills councils that are signed up to by everyone who supplies, funds and plans education and training. They are created by a process which involves a number of partners, including employers through the sector skills councils, trade associations and employer bodies, and organisations that supply and fund education and training. This process has 5 stages. First of all, a sophisticated assessment is made of each sector to determine short-term, medium-term and long-term needs and map out the factors for change in the sector. Secondly, current training provision across all levels is reviewed to measure its range, nature and employer relevance. Thirdly, the main gaps and weaknesses in workforce development are analysed and priorities are agreed. Fourthly, a review is conducted into the scope of collaborative action, engaging employers to invest skills development to support improved business performance, and an assessment is made into what employers are likely to sign up. Lastly, the final outcome is an agreement of how sector skills councils and employers will work with key funding partners to secure the necessary supply of training. In 2006, the government had a major report called the Leach Report, which looked into what the needs were for the UK and how those NVQs and so on were working. It was decided that we needed we were now a more service-led country with high value-added economy. We'd lost our manufacturing base in the UK. We were more of a bit of a think tank at a higher level end and service-led at the other skills-led end. So the aims, the Leach Report set out aims for the year 2020. Don't forget this is in 2006, 6 years ago, lots happened since then. So in 2006, our aims for 2020 were to have adult skills, including 14 to 19, exceeding 90% of the qualifications to level 2. So level 2 is, level 3 is just before university, level 2 is before that. There's an increase of 69%, which is what it was in 2005. And 40% of adults had to be qualified up to level 4, which is the first year of university, if you like, and above. up from 29% in 2005. The population is an ageing population. There's been huge technological change. Global migration flows are increasing, and it was thought that there's a direct correlation between skills, productivity and employment. The Leach report thought there should be a shared responsibility. Employers, individuals and the government must increase action and investment, and they should do that by building on existing structures. So the shared responsibilities were employers, individuals and the government increasing action and investment, employers and individuals contributing mostly where they derive the greatest private returns. Government investment should focus on market failures, ensuring a basic platform of skills for all, targeting help where it is needed most. There should be a focus on economically valuable skills. Skills development must provide real returns for individuals, employers and society. Wherever possible, skills should be portable to deliver mobility in the labour market for individuals and employers. The skills should be demand-led. The skills system must meet the needs of individuals and employers. Vocational skills must be demand-led rather than centrally planned. They have to adapt and respond. No one can accurately predict the future demand for particular types of skills. The framework must be flexible, and it must build on existing structures. We needed to strengthen the employer voice in 2006, to rationalise existing bodies, strengthen the collective voice and better articulate employer views. We needed to increase employer engagement and investment in skills, and to launch a new pledge for employers to voluntarily commit to train all eligible employers up to level 2 at the very least. In 2010, the review process of employer, that we would review the process of employer delivery. If the improvement rate is insufficient, Leach suggested that we introduce a statutory entitlement to workplace training at level 2 in consultation with employers and unions, which could become compulsory. Following the Leach report, there's been a huge change in the economic climate, which meant that priorities have changed, and it was not always possible to pursue all parts of Leach. A research report found that it may well be the case that increased skills lead to an increase in national prosperity, but there is a surprising lack of evidence to support this conclusion. There is clearly a need for more research to establish whether or not there is a causal relationship. This would help to justify the commitment of considerable public expenditure on training and skills development. Nevertheless, even without this evidence, we note there are no voices that have been raised to question the principle that it is right to aim towards a more highly skilled workforce, both in terms of individual benefit and for the wider good. So, curiously, even though it's only been a few years increasing this skills base, there didn't seem to be any huge economic return or difference, although people were still saying it must be a good thing. More problematic is the complexity of skills delivery mechanisms and the failure to communicate urgency of need to the employers and the individuals. Can you believe that after all this energy put into it, there are people that still, and employers and individuals who still do not realise what is happening and what it is they need to do? Shared responsibility and responsiveness to demand comprise a sound philosophy for the development of skills in the UK workforce. The difficulties arise in translating them into practical policies for implementation. To avoid demand-led and partnership becoming meaningless jargon, these difficulties still need to be addressed. So there's no evidence that either employers or individuals will take up the full role in partnership envisaged by the Leach report. In the current economic downturn, it's essential then that the government programme, Train to Gain, that's one of the catchphrases that they use for people to attend a programme called Train to Gain, as the main source of government funding for skills development is made flexible enough to deal with rapid adjustments for people who have been made redundant and need quick retraining, and with businesses anxious to develop in response to new challenges. Government should look at other ways to encourage employer participation, such as considering companies' training policies and practices during procurement processes. In sectors where significant progress has not been made by 2014, compulsion must be seriously considered. There's particular problems amongst the small and medium-sized industries and enterprises. So the economic climate makes it more imperative to raise the skills level, even more imperative now things have changed, that we continue to address these problems. It is a concern that the conflation of skills and qualifications in the targets may lead government to assume that a qualifications strategy is an adequate substitute or proxy for an overall skills strategy. We've got so tied up with bringing qualifications on board that we've almost lost sight of actually we're trying to improve people's abilities and skills here. This may drive up levels of attainment, having a qualification strategy may drive up levels of attainment and improve the UK's position in international league tables, and it may also contribute towards improved economic performance, but a real skills and training strategy would focus more on skills utilisation by companies to achieve high performance work practices and so raise productivity. There's still a strong need to encourage employers and other players to sign up to even what the Leach's agenda and to associate targets for greater investment in skills. Constant change creates uncertainty, and as the wider economy currently demonstrates all too well, uncertainty tends to undermine the confidence that is needed for investment to take place. So here is what not to do in the future to avoid the tendency for the system to regress. No new disconnected initiatives, more joined up thinking. No separate contracts for different elements of the Train to Gain service. No different reporting or monitoring rules outside of what we've currently got. No new business-facing brands beyond what we've already got, which is Business Link, Train to Gain, apprenticeships, so on. No new agencies beyond those already announced. So in this furore to make things better, the policymakers come in and say, let's change it, let's make it better, and actually it can contribute to worse. As the UK comes out of recession, people will be needed who can pick up the new range of jobs which emerge at that time. The emphasis within skills policy on reskilling is therefore vital. Redundancies force people to seek to move to other sectors in which their current qualifications may be irrelevant. So with qualification reforms carrying on, a serious consideration needs to be given to the accreditation of prior learning to accommodate non-traditional courses, leading to acquisition of learning and skills, and at an appropriate level, such as bite-sized courses or part-time and informal training. We are still supplying skills and expecting businesses to utilise them rather than following a demand-led approach. I think things have got better, but they haven't got in any way strongly better than they have been before. So a brief look at what's happening with apprenticeships. Access to apprenticeships will provide employment for young people aged 16 to 24. However, demographic change will reduce the number of young people, and so adult apprenticeships have now become very much encouraged. The National Apprenticeship Service works closely with colleges and training providers across the country. There's a need to raise awareness of the opportunities for the take-up of these new apprenticeships. This is right up to date now. We're in 2012, and apprenticeships have almost gone full circle. My dad did one in 1940. They kind of went away in the 1990s, and now they've come back again with a different shape. Support is available for eligible employers to offer young people employment through the apprenticeship programme, and grants are provided to employers to do that. In 2010 there were 8 higher apprenticeships which were developed, with additional apprenticeship frameworks being developed in several other occupational areas, and that has now happened. The higher level apprenticeships have been developed can lead to university level education. So they start on an apprenticeship programme, it gets them up to levels 2 and 3, and if they have the propensity to do so, that they can then go on and do what's known as a foundation degree, which is equivalent to a HND, a higher national diploma, the second year of a university degree. Creating career pathways right through to higher level roles and ongoing opportunities to maximise the benefits of a highly skilled workforce, with progression to postgraduate study even, if that's a possibility, and the attainment of professional qualifications to more sectors of the economy. In higher education, the role of higher education in its relationship with employers has been a point of weakness. The attitudes of employers have been that universities are ivory towers, on the whole, to summarise, and that they're not responsive enough, and they don't necessarily provide what we need. They might produce intelligent people who can think, but they can't necessarily do the job. That's a broad sweeping statement. That's just one of the strong criticisms that's been levelled. There are increased numbers of students now going to university since these reforms, and acquiring the level 4 skills that were recommended by Leach. The industry co-funding, have this notion of co-funding, in which employers, it was hoped, would contribute at least 50% towards the qualification, has not been forthcoming, and the quantity required to meet the targets, which were 20,000 places. The current economic turndown makes this level of employer investment hard to attain. We need to establish what the employer's reluctance is to engage with higher education, and raise awareness of higher education opportunities, and increase employer demand. It's not solely the task of the higher education sector to say to employers, you need to look in this direction. Employer organisations need to engage more collaboratively with both higher education and further education. That's the lower level education, which leads into a higher education. And many of these awards and levels that have been recommended cross that divide between level 3 and level 4, between what we term further education and higher education. It needs to be strengthened so students can have a progression path and people can move their skills and development upwards. An example of an integrated lifelong learning system is in the UK is work-based learning. Work-based learning proliferates in the UK. It's mainly for employee development rather than people initially before they go out into the place of work, but it does have a lot of crossovers. It's been funded by the government since 2003. We did have a European project with Grundtvig on work-based learning. There didn't seem to be very much going on in other European countries that we worked with at that time. And I think there is a little more going on, but we have it in almost every university in the UK. It's been hugely successful, and it's based on, well, each university differs on trans or interdisciplinary notion, born from independent learning and adult learning, and from learning from experience. So the research into work-based learning and its success seems to be that what is successful with employers is a mixture of accreditation, accreditation of prior experiential learning, with that means not just acknowledging someone has prior certificated learning, but acknowledging their experience and the reflexivity and critical thinking that goes into that experience. So they would put together a portfolio in that regard. So it means it is a module of educational work which draws on their experience. And flexible award structures based on shorter and cumulative learning. So that's smaller units, even smaller than a module that you would build into a module if you were in a credit-based system. And that's successful for employers and employees. To do this, you need a framework of validated awards. So instead of universities saying, this is, let's say, a bachelor's degree, and this is what you have to do to get it, here's the knowledge banked up here. It's much more flexible than that. It's in smaller amounts. It can use knowledge which is banked, already credited by the university and understood and taught, but it can also utilise the training provision that employers have, and the experience of individuals, and so on and so forth. It's been developed into quite a complex framework which has been successful with employers. Work-based learning has been able to impact on individuals and organisations by using the expertise of universities and applying it to the needs of work. When we thought about it, how difficult is it? We had all this experience of critical thinking, how to do research, how to reflect. How can we apply that in the best way possible to meet the needs of both creativity and utility, both? How can we do that? Because if anyone has the skills to do that, surely it's in the higher education sector. And we could share those ideas also with the other sectors who also have ideas on that. So we've had quite some success with this. The civil service, for example, is accessing work-based learning as its main source of employee development. It links in, we link in with their staff appraisal schemes. We use APEL to incorporate company training into awards. We have build-up of credits towards qualification. The content is discussed and agreed between the employer and the university, ensuring that the standards are there and the employer needs are there. So to conclude, the links, work-based learning is an example of how I started out by suggesting that we should have links between training and education. It's creative and useful, and incorporates the idea of graduateness. Do you have that notion of graduateness? What it means to be a graduate. The companies employ graduates. They expect people to come in and think laterally and be able to do things. Why can't you learn that on the job? So if you want to look up work-based learning, you could Google it.
Ja, kas soovib keegi küsida? Siin oli praktilisi näiteid ja tehnoloogiaid küll mitte veel. Ja, eesti keeles saab rahulikult küsida kohe telline küsimuse ära, palun. Margitsut, palun. Üks hetk peale kohe telega mikrofoni.
My name is Margit Sutrab. I'm from the University of Tartu, and thank you very much for this very nice speech that you gave. It was very enlightening. I have to ask it in Estonian in order to make it available. Minu küsimus oleks üsna konkreetne. Te ütlesite, et praeguse haridussüsteemi raskus majanduskriisi tingimustes on see, et see, mida haridusasutused ei toodavad hariduse mõttes, ei pruugi vastata ühiskonna vajadustele. So that what has been provided, the education that has been provided. You don't understand?
I didn't.
You don't catch it?
I didn't have it on the.
I can very briefly translate if you want.
Thank you.
The educational institutions often do not provide exactly this sort of education or this sort of skills that are really needed for the labor market. You gave a very good example about the universities, for example, but it's perhaps the same with the other institutions. Now, the question is that we have been here discussing in Estonia is whether actually sometimes the problem is that we have to change the society. It's not that the society knows what they need, but education must be a step forward. The question is whether there is a discussion in the United Kingdom about this, because, as we say, we do not know ourselves where the society is going, but we might have ideas about where we want to lead them, to avoid the future crisis, for example. Eesti keeles öelduna on küsimus siis selles, et vahetevahel institutsioonid arvavad, et nad toodavad haridust, mis on vajalik tuleviku ühiskonnale, aga kahjuks ei ole ühiskond võib-olla ise sellises staadiumis, nagu me tahaksime. Me ise tahame ühiskonda kujundada ja haridusel on suur vastutus ühiskonna kujundamisel. Kas Inglismaal on seda sorti diskussioon olnud?
Yeah, okay, thanks. We do, and you're right, it does have to come, people awareness needs to be raised. Clearly, this could start in school straight away with our young people. That's a way that governments can have an influence. We have a good example in the northeast of England, which is one of the most deprived areas around Tyneside, where they even have a place in the shopping centre where people can drop in and talk about training and lifelong learning and things like that. So it's open to all people. One of the big issues we've got is that people are just not aware of what's possible for them to do, where they can source the kind of things they need. For some reason, it seems to be that the marketing, if you like, of this idea needs to be sharpened up. Maybe we need expertise from marketeers and people like that to raise awareness. And we do it in societies on socially important areas, like we've done it to stop people smoking, to stop people drinking and driving. Big campaigns of social awareness have been brought on for health. We could do similar for education.
Ja, palun siia poole.
Aitäh ettekande eest, see oli väga huvitav. Aga mul oleks küsimus, te hästi rõhutasite sellele, et tööandja peaks investeerima oma töötajate koolitusse. Et ma ei tunne nii hästi teie riigisüsteemi, aga missugune on siis roll riigi haridussüsteemil ja missugune roll on siis inimesel endal, kui palju ta peab ise endasse investeerima, et olla tööjõuturul konkurentsivõimeline? Aitäh!
Yeah, so it's a welfare state in the UK. People should invest themselves. It's become more and more means tested. So individuals now, for example, have to pay to go to university, whereas 10 years ago, less than 10 years ago, they didn't. The fees went up to 3,000 a year, now they're 9,000 a year. And similarly, with other areas of training, people pay according to their ability to pay. Where people can't pay, that's when the government intervention comes in. The government thinks that if particularly private, large, transnational private companies are gaining from this education and training hugely, then they should pay. They should pay towards it, and that there should be benchmarks against which all companies should at least have minimal training and the priority to develop young people. Now, I think that there's been quite a lot of success with very large companies, but when it comes to the medium-sized enterprises and even the small enterprises, how do they access that training when some of them are actually going bust in the current economic climate and can't afford to lose one person out of the 3 people that they employ, and so on. That's, I think, where the area of the problem is, the main area.
Ja, palun.
Te andsite väga kena ülevaate ettevõtjate strateegiatest, kuidas nad kujundavad töötajate oskusi, kuidas töötajad tõsta tööviljakust, paremini teenindada töötaja või kliente ja nii edasi. Aga kui me vaatame ühiskonna nõudmistest, siis peaks vaatama ka töötajate ja ametiühingute seisukohast, kas nüüd neid oskusi, mis on töötajatel vaja, et parandada oma suhtlemisoskust, kokkuleppimise ja läbirääkimiste oskust, konflikti lahendamise oskust ja nii edasi, kas neid oskusi ka on piisavalt käsitletud, kas töötajad ja ametiühingud saavad ka selleks piisavalt ettevalmistust?
Yes, there's a very good organisation called Union Learn. There's quite a few publications, if you wanted to look that up, Union Learn, which have addressed what you've just said and thoroughly agree with what you say.
Palun. Kui hetkel küsimusi ei ole, siis ma julgeksin ikkagi esitada ühe viimase küsimuse. Ja see võib-olla rohkem on seotud demokraatiaga ja riigikorraldusega, aga arvestades, et Eestis on ka hariduses väga suured muudatused hetkel käimas ja ka Eestis on olemas midagi sarnast võib-olla laual nagu Lord Sandy Leitchi kokkuvõtte süsteemi probleemidest. Kuidas ikkagi juhtus see, et need tema ettepanekud iseseisvast või sellisest sõltumatust raportist muutusid reaalsuseks, et neid hakati arvestama, et nendega hakati tööd tegema?
It was government legislation. You know, the government commissioned the report in the first place. Then we used the existing structures. As I said, we had the National Vocational Qualifications since the early 90s, so we did use existing structures and also built new structures. Things looked, and that was in 2006, and the implementation was good at that time. It's since then, since the recession, since 2008, that things got to a level of complexity. If things didn't seem to work, then they changed it. Even the sector skills councils that I was just talking about, and it's very difficult to tell people about it without bringing in too many things, have changed now. They're now called the sector skills funding agencies. So, you know, they keep changing the names of things, and it's, if you're in the system and it's getting confusing, can you imagine what it's like for people who are a step away? But yes, they did it through legislation, and they did it through existing structures.
Suur aitäh, professor Costley. Me oleme oma päeva esimese poolega jõudnud nüüd sinnani, kus on tunniajaline lõuna, mis on siin poole päeva. Mis on vanas hotellis. Vana hotelli restoranis loodetavasti on teil veel piisavalt pintisid, et keegi ära ei eksi. Ma ootan igal juhul teid tagasi siia 13.45, et siis juba vaadata üle see olukord, milline valitseb siis Eestis ka nende kohtumiste põhjal, mis aasta jooksul toimetatud sai. Head isupidega.
Nii, et tahate meie restorani kokkaks tulla?
Ma ütlesin jah, et proovin elus midagi uut. Ma olen ju terve elu olnud matemaatikaõpetaja, aga toidu tegemist olen ma alati armastanud. Käisin isegi omal käel pitsakursusel. Jah, palun, nüüd võib öelda, pitsa, see on minu leivanumber. Kindlasti õpin ära ka itaalia keele, et saaksin minna profide juurde. Maitske, see on minu enda kasvatatud tomatitest, ürkidest. Olge jah, võtke vastu. Palun proovige.